everyone. Very happy to see you all, and I hope we'll have a good time this year. I'll just give an introduction a little bit to the seminar. Some of you have been here before, others are new. Tell you a little bit what it is and how we like to work. And also a little bit, of course, then the topic, what we're going to do this year, and how I see that. And then we'll also talk about some of the sort of housekeeping things, the dates, seminars, and things like that. Yeah. And then hopefully we'll also still have time to really get started on the topic, but we'll see about that, how far we get. Yeah. I've just pulled up, but I don't know if everybody knows that, but the seminar has a blog called German Philosophy, one word, .wordpress.com. And on that blog you can see all the seminars going back to 2013 seminars. This is before that, but what we did in various years, and readings there as well, and also the page for the seminar of this year, the process philosophy page. Yeah. We'll do a bit of a round of introductions in a minute as well. This seminar is hosted by the Institute of Modern Languages Research at the School of Advanced Study, and within that, more specifically, the Ernst Bloch Center for German Thought, which moved from Sheffield, where Peter Thompson was here, ran it until the beginning of this year, has moved from Sheffield to London. And this context of German philosophy, and then in particular the philosophy of Ernst Bloch, which may not be familiar to everyone, but we'll get to talk about that, determines in a way sort of the content of the seminar. The seminar has been going since 2008, and the format is usually that we meet on a bi-weekly basis. Last year we met every week, but now we're going back to bi-weekly. And we take a topic that is in some sense related to Bloch's philosophy, or to the history of German philosophy, to the history of German idealism, or any topic that has to do with that. And so we've had seminars on materialism in German thought. We had a seminar last year on the question of thinking being, where we engaged idealism and materialism critical theory with Heidegger. And we also had a seminar which I personally liked a lot on the West Eastern couch, which was a comparison of two tales. The tale of Lao Tzu disappearing into the mountains, and the tale of Empedocles jumping into the crater of Mount Etna. And we read these two tales, we compared them as two tales that deal with the relation of the individual to the absolute, and contrasted them. And we also contrast them to the history of German literature, because the first tale of Empedocles was very important for Hölderlin at the beginning of the German idealist period, and the tale of Lao Tzu disappearing into the mountains after he'd written the Tao Te Ching was very important for Bertolt Brecht, who wrote a famous poem about it, and it was also very important for Bloch himself. And so that was a very interesting seminar. Then last year we talked about thinking being, and that we'll talk more about that as we go on, because that was a very intensive journey that we had. And now this year we're going to talk about process philosophy. And process philosophy, of course, you might say, has got nothing to do with German philosophy, because process philosophy is predominantly an American thing, connected with the name of Whitehead, but also Dewey and maybe even Emerson and people like that, sort of the 19th century transcendentalists in American thought. Also closely linked to pragmatism. And so there isn't a real tradition of process thought as such in German thought. That's not a problem, we don't have to limit ourselves to that. But of course we must note that German idealism is in many ways a kind of process philosophy. It's in many ways a philosophy, as Hegel says, from substance to subject, is a philosophy that is about movement. It's a philosophy that's about history, a way of thinking, the dialectic that tries to think movement and development as intrinsic features of the real. In a text by Bloch that we will read, this will come out, and I think there are many interesting parallels to be drawn between process philosophy in its American form and what we see in the thinking around Bloch and Adorno and this kind of early phase of the Frankfurt School as well. So we'll explore that a little bit. And that is, I think, provides enough of a background to say, why is it interesting for us to look at process philosophy? Now there's a second element, so there's the process element in the history of German thought. So how do we think development, movement, etc., closely linked to the project of German idealism and everything that comes after that. There's also an angle that I want to explore more myself, and that is this element that I built it in specifically. That's this element of world philosophy. So it's the idea that the Western philosophical tradition can be brought into dialogue with other philosophical traditions. That's of course a well-established field in comparative philosophy. But I think there are very interesting developments at the moment in scholarship that take that to another level. Not so much just a comparison of different philosophical traditions, but actually, as our culture is globalizing, we are seeing maybe the development of a global philosophical culture. And what is the relation of that global phase of philosophical thinking to the various traditions that go into it? And that, for me, creates a new question. How Western thought, and in our case we're mostly at Chinese philosophy, how Western and Eastern thought, Chinese thought, how they relate to each other. And this is where the process theme also comes in a big way. Whitehead says in the beginning of Process and Reality, in the introduction, he says process philosophy is closer to Chinese cosmology than to Western metaphysics, because it makes process basic rather than substance, or process rather than form. Yeah? So that is an interesting question for me. How does that work? What does it mean? And what can we do with it? And how does it relate to the history of German thought or European thought in particular? And so that's sort of the scholarly background. So I want to sort of also for our work in the Bloch Center, I want to sort of look at this question of world philosophy. I want to bring that into the purview of what we do. And that's also a very Blochian theme. Bloch's student, Heinz Kimmele, a name that you may know or may not know, who became professor of philosophy in Rotterdam, I knew him there, was one of the founders of what was called in the 70s Intercultural Philosophy. So he wrote a quite well-known book in German about it, Intercultural Philosophy, and he stood at the cradle of this development of comparative philosophy, or philosophy as an intercultural dialogue.
Excuse me, could you repeat that please? I mean, his student?
Kimmele, Heinz Kimmele.
Heinz Kimmele in Rotterdam?
Yeah, he was in Rotterdam, he's now either dead or very old. Heinz Kimmele. And there's a very nice anecdote.
You said you found what? Okay, could you repeat that?
Sure, yeah. He found it, he was one of the people behind what he called in German Intercultural Philosophy. So, intercultural philosophy. And wrote a book with that title. And so took the ideas that we find in Bloch's thinking around cultures and the relation between cultures is very often misunderstood. Bloch is not a Eurocentric thinker at all. No, we can't all sit on this side, so.
I'll go back in 2 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. I just want to point out the fact that within the tradition of German scholarship, and in particular also the philosophy of Bloch, there is this thing that leads us to ask the question of what does it mean for philosophical traditions to go into dialogue with each other. And how can that dialogue be understood not as a dialogue between fixed viewpoints, but as an evolving dialogue in which different traditions can learn from each other, treat each other as equal. Yeah? So there has always been, well, I'm not going to go into the whole history of the encounter between Eastern and Western thought. That's, of course, there's a whole lot to be said about that. I'm going to take it here in a creative sense. So we are going to read Chinese philosophy, and we're going to read process philosophy, and then we're going to see what can we do with it. Yeah? How can we maybe move it a little bit further, both of them? Yeah?
Well, it seems that the intercultural philosophy was a necessary offshoot of the whole idea of world literature, even going back together.
Yeah.
In the 19th century, I mean, of course, the 19th century German preoccupation with cultures. I mean, that was, I think, the intercultural philosophy was a necessary offshoot of all those movements prior to the 20th century.
That's right. Of course, Goethe invents the term world literature.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's just a matter of waiting until we get to world philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, the encounters of different cultures, of different, literatures and so on and so forth. So
yeah. And so that's right. I see intercultural, this phase of the development of a world philosophy, this phase that was called intercultural philosophy, as a kind of stepping stone from the idea that philosophy was a European thing to a notion of world philosophy that is emerging today.
Yeah, just going back to your earlier point about process philosophy. I mean, of course, German idealism was very much, very similar to process philosophy. But then, on the other hand, in the French tradition, in post-structuralism, there's actually, and on that side, it branched off Bergson.
Yeah.
Deleuze and all those people, they all emphasize the becoming rather than being. So process philosophy is not just limited to the German tradition either. Except that in the case of Bergson, he doesn't really talk about the world philosophy or that kind of thing. But then he did, turn everything into process. So
yeah, that's right. So there's a big, and this will be a theme that we'll explore in depth. There will be this big difference between the view of becoming that we get in German idealism and what comes after, a dialectical process, and becoming as it functions in Bergson's philosophy, which is not a dialectical process.
Definitely.
So what he calls intuition is not a dialectical process of becoming. And actually, Bloch has written a large chapter in Prinzip Hoffnung, the book Principle of Hope, where he discusses the relation between his view of dialectic and Bergsonian becoming. He sees Bergsonian becoming as a kind of bourgeois sentiment, so I think that's wrong. Yeah, but he definitely says what is missing for him in Bergson's view of becoming is the rupture, the negation. There is no negation there, it is just all one smooth flow. Yeah? A creative advance. And creative evolution.
Yeah.
And that's the point that we will talk about. So this is the role of the negative in the dialectic as contrasted to Bergson's creative evolution. And then we'll try to find out how that works in process philosophy, where we get something that sort of moves us beyond these two alternatives.
Yeah, but actually, on the other hand, though, interesting enough, people keep accusing Hegel and Hegelian dialectic is a dialectic without rupture. Whereas the person who really introduced rupture to the dialectic, as per Etienne Balibar, is actually Marx.
Of course, yeah.
So, without Marx, German dialectic would be dialectic without rupture.
That's right, absolutely. It would be logicism. yeah, would be idealism. That's
Yeah,
idealism.
I would like what.
Can everybody follow these terms or not? Yeah?
It's okay.
Is that okay, yeah? If you don't follow it, say it, because we all have different backgrounds. We haven't even done our introductions.
But the one about the recording, is it the way the lecture is supposed to go, or you want a continuous flow of the recording and then at the end of it there's some discussion?
No. I very much would want this to be a group discussion. Of course, I will instruct and tell what I think, but I think there should be a collective effort. Yeah, I'll get to that now as well. Yeah, but yeah, so that's an important point. The Marx is materializing of the dialectic, introduces rupture in the concept of dialectical development.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where Bloch takes it from, and the whole
exactly.
school takes
Yeah.
it from.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an important point.
By the way, so where in Bloch did he discuss a reaction?
In the principle of law.
Oh.
In the second part.
Okay.
Yeah. So now, maybe we should, before I go now into the seminar itself, maybe we should do a quick round of introduction so we know who we are. Yeah, that's probably a good idea. Huh? Can't escape it. If you don't want to say, it's all. If you don't want to say anything, don't say anything. Yeah, it's completely. You're completely free here. Huh? This is the only place in the academy today where you can be free. So my name is Johan Siebers, as you know. I'm here at the Institute for Language Research, specialized in German philosophy, especially Bloch. I'm also associate professor of philosophy and religion at Middlesex University. And I've been here since for almost 10 years now, so a long time.
I'm Nina Riesmal. I'm a PhD student in German in Cambridge, and I'm writing my PhD thesis on the role of utopian thinking in critical theory.
I'm Helga, and I am an artist, and I have studied at Berkeley College philosophy up to BA, and I come here for many years now.
You are one of the oldest participants in the seminar. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm Yin Liu, a professor in Nankai University in China. I'm an academic visitor here in Royal Holloway, and my field is literature, American literature.
My name is Xu Jun. I used to be a Chinese lawyer in China. I did some law studies in London. I developed interest in philosophy in this very Institute of Philosophy. I've only been to a few the Institute of Modern Linguistic Studies, but this is for me fascinating. Thank you.
My name is Peter Thompson. I set up the Bloch Centre at Sheffield. I'm not there anymore, I've retired now. I've published on Bloch quite a lot. Published a book on Bloch with Zizek 2 years ago. And yeah, so this is my new life now. I've just retired. So I'm going to come along to this and participate as well as I can. I live in Oxford.
You don't speak the predicate form of proposition.
Well, that is precisely, why Chinese is so much closer to the process of philosophy.
Yeah, that's right, because in Chinese is so...
The language is completely different from, the classical Chinese language. I'm not talking about the modern Chinese language, though.
And there are examples in contemporary thought where people have tried to develop a purely verb-based language. One example is David Bohm, the physicist who was at Birkbeck, who tried to devise this kind of language which he called the Rio mode. So we will examine that in one of the seminars, from Reor to flow. Yeah.
What's the name again? David
Bohm, B-O-H-M.
the German.
Well, he wasn't German, but it's a German name. So he developed this verbal, purely verbal language, which he called the Rio mode. And a contemporary thinker that we read last year and who will also visit us hopefully in the spring for a lecture from the United States, Alan White, has also done something like that in developing an articulation of being that uses only the continuous form of the verb in English, so the ing ending, as a kind of verbal substitute for sein or entity or being as a noun. Yeah.
Well, actually, when he did that
So,
in Leader and the Swan, uses a series of, I think that is called germs, so as to make it as, I mean, because normally in the English language you can only take one word in one sentence, but
Yeah.
precisely because he uses a string of germs, so he can achieve that effect without violating the grammar.
yeah, okay, yeah. So this is an interesting question. How do we have to violate the grammar or not in order to articulate the process? So that's going to be a big question. Now, okay, let me just go over the seminar first. You can tell that technology is not my forte. It should come on again now. There we go. Yeah. So, I want to first create a bit of an awareness of what we're trying to do here. Yeah? So we're trying to think process. That is, we're trying to understand flow. We're trying to understand what it means that our experience has the nature of a flow. That is, of course, in first instance is time, earlier and later. There's maybe not just time. So one question would be, what is the relation between process and time? What is that relationship?
And even the term time actually, I mean, if you look at it from the point of view of comparative philosophy, even the term time should be subjected to scrutiny.
Yeah, of
in
course.
the sense that, I mean, in Western, especially modern Western thinking, process is very much related to time. I mean, and yet, I mean, in, for example, Buddhist thinking and Taoist thinking, I mean, it's very much process, but time in the Western sense is an illusion.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
So that's
so the term time itself should be subjected to scrutiny in the first place. And even before we can talk about it.
if we take a classical Western view, then we might say, yeah, there is time and there is space. These are forms of extension or extensionality. But then there is something that is outside of time and space. Yeah, thought, maybe mathematics, ideas, the soul itself, maybe even in certain views. This is Western thought from the time of Plato and Aristotle is based on the idea that there is time and space, and there is that which is not in time and space. Yeah. So that's always a difficulty with, I think that's why process philosophers have had such a hard time making a point here in the Western context. Because if you take the process philosopher to be somebody who says, yeah, of everything that there is, this is the most important or the most central, then the simple answer or the simple response is, well, what about time, and what about space, what about numbers, what about, yeah? So then and I think this is what you see in a lot of process literature, you see then the attempt to explain that all of these things actually boil down to some form of temporal reality. And I think that is a very weak point. That doesn't really work.
I'm sorry, I can't read. I mean, what is outside time? Is that thought, numbers, and what else?
Well, it depends on your philosophy. There's ideas, for example, in Plato, or even the soul. Yeah, they all are not spatial temporal. The way in which, sometimes in the tradition, this is articulated, is in the idea of the nunc stans. As you know, maybe, the standing now, the still standing now, which, as Plato says, the now is out of time. It's in time, but it's out of time. It's that in time which is not in time, the absolute now. Yeah, and in the idea of a completed knowing the mind of God, as we see it in Plato, Spinoza, and even down to Hegel, I think in a certain sense also. Ultimately, there is this idea that there is no development of movement. Reality is complete. Yeah, nunc stans. So you might say the process philosopher is somebody who tries to think nunc movens. So the now is moving. The now as process. And that's where we begin to see that, because this now is of course also for Bloch a very important term, this now is not necessarily a temporal notion. Or time can be seen as maybe some kind of intellectual abstraction on the basis of a more primary experience. And that's one of the first things that is for us very important to bear in mind when we want to understand what process philosophy is. We have to move away from the idea in the European tradition of time and space on the one hand and something that's not in time and space on the other, without saying everything is in time or everything is in time and space. Yeah? So that indeed, as you said, that in the, I think, as far as I know about it, in Chinese philosophy that is different. This notion of time does not bother so much because it isn't there. Yeah? That's one thing. Two has to do with this point of negativity. Let me give you a short list. Yeah? Heidegger, in his introduction to metaphysics, says we have four notions of being. There is, so he says sein, natuurlijk, but we don't say that. There is sein und werden. So being and becoming. Some things are, and some things are becoming. And then he says there is being and what we could say in English, reality and appearance. So some things appear to be something that they are not. Yeah? That's a different sense of being. And then he says there is being, or is, and ought. So...
I'm sorry, what was the second? Being...
Appearance.
Sorry?
Appearance. Yeah? Erscheinen. And then there is being and is and ought. So things are, but they are not the way they should be. It's a different dimension. Yeah? And then he says, okay, and these are all, so this is all inner worldly. This is ontic, as you would say. And then there is the fourth one, being and nothing. Yeah? So for Heidegger's way of thinking, it's immediately clear that this relation between being and becoming is for him philosophically not interesting. Yeah? What is interesting is the relation between being and nothing. Because being and becoming is just another form of being for Heidegger. It's just something that we find in the world. Things change and they move. It's that old conception of time. Yeah? something's static, something's change, but they're both beings. So not fundamental categorization, whereas being and nothing is. Once we become aware of the fact that there is this, or is, you can't say it, but there is this nothingness, then we become aware of a kind of fundamental philosophical depth to things, that everything is floating in this nothingness, and where does it come from? Yeah? Or what is the relation between being and nothing? So this is just an example to say this earlier, that Heidegger also stays within this idea that becoming, like time, is not a fundamentally philosophically interesting concept. It's not fundamental enough. Now, of course, in Hegel we already begin to see that it's different, because for Hegel it's precisely the relation between being and nothing that is at work in the concept of becoming. Becoming is a Sein and Nichts, as the beginning of the logic, is the relation with the werden, to become, is the relation between being and nothing. That's what it is. Ultimately, the going from one to the other is becoming.
Could you remind me where Heidegger discusses the forms of being?
This is in the Introduction to Metaphysics.
Okay, introduction to metaphysics.
So that's another point to say we have to get away from many assumptions that are very, very deep-seated in Western philosophy. When we want to start to understand process, not as a kind of process philosophy, not as a kind of reductionism that says substance thinkers say that what is basic in the world is substances, and now we are going to say that what is basic in the world is process. Well, I think we have to try to move away from that. Yeah? And one of the ways to do that is to think about these things that have to do with time and have to do with the way the concept of being can be set up from the beginning.
Just one question. You brought earlier that time and space are both extensions, but that doesn't sound. I mean, in German idealism, I mean, time is not extension; it's intention, actually. Like, I mean, that is what Bergson picked up on later. That, I mean, space is extension, but time is not. So why do you say that both of them are?
Well,
extension?
because I use a Kantian idea that time and space are
Mental constructs.
Are the forms of intuition.
Okay,
Yeah.
that I
They are
yes.
They are the forms of intuition. I mean, this gets very technical now, but Whitehead says, which I think is one of his deepest remarks, he says the transcendental aesthetic is a distorted fragment of what should have been Kant's main topic. And I think if we at the end of the seminar we understand this sentence, then we have done quite a lot. Yeah? But that's the direction to which I go. Okay, now, so what is it then about process that we have to focus on to see where it's a philosophically interesting concept? That is, and that's what I put in the outline of the seminar, that is this moment of spontaneity. And that's again an aspect where we touch on Chinese philosophy. Yeah? So I said, we'll investigate the relation between thought, spontaneity, and movement. In short, living thought, a thought-thinking experience. Spontaneity and movement are nothing fixed, and so it seems that the philosophical understanding of time is not to itself, be at least to some extent fluid, moving, or spontaneous understanding. What is required is an unprincipled, an-archic form of thought. Life cannot be a defining characteristic. Whitehead says it is a name for originality and not for tradition. So the moving now is that in our experience which is new. And this key term for block is on. What does it mean for us to try to articulate in thought the moment in experience that has to do with this newness, with novelty, which is in a way just every next moment is new, if you want to put it like that, but there's also creativity, it's also new creation. Yeah? So I think the philosophical depth of the active process has to do with this spontaneous coming into being. Yeah? There we touch on the being and nothing, becoming and being, the becoming and that which is going from nothing to being. And then from being to nothing again, because things also disappear. So how do we think this moment of the new occurring? That seems to me to be the core of process philosophy. That it tries to find a way to articulate that. It tries to find a way to show that articulating this or understanding this moment where not things come into being, but where being occurs, as it were. We have to drop the word being, where there is just occurring. That this has fundamental repercussions for the rest of philosophy. This is not just something that we can add on to our philosophical project. It changes everything. That is what we're trying to understand. Is that clear?
Yes.
Yeah. So I see this seminar as a way for us to come to understand what spontaneity is. What spontaneity is in our experience, what it is for ourselves, and how we understand it and how it relates to other things that we understand in philosophy. Also ethically, but, first of all, let's try to stick with this understanding of spontaneity. So, understanding something that's uncaused, and that yet happens, or that creates its causes, you've written about that, Peter, a lot, that creates its causes retrospectively, as it were. Yeah? But there, in that kind of retrospective causality, there's also something that originates just out of itself. Yeah? So, Chuang Tzu, I don't know if you pronounce his name correctly, has this wonderful tale where he says somewhere in these tales where he says everything arises spontaneously out of itself, everything, and we've got no idea how that is possible. Yeah. So this is the thing I want to get to, and I want to sort of relate that back into the kind of philosophy that we know. And I think that is what process philosophy tries to do if it's done correctly or if it's done in an interesting way. And that means that we have to, yeah. I mean, I always get a bit nervous when I talk about it because it is a point that can easily be overlooked. Or it's also a point at which you can easily say, yeah, come on, that's not... you can't talk about that. It has something to do with this, the limits of language. It's difficult to think about it. And that's why I've also made the link to Zen practice. Because in Zen practice you get something that has to do with this. You get a kind of moving away from intellectual understanding to relate to the spontaneous occurrence of the moment as it happens. There's an interesting, we'll discuss that hopefully as well, there's an interesting question, what does the appropriation of Zen Buddhism in the West on the traditions of late capitalism, what does that mean? Zizek as regularly makes a point about that. He thinks that this is largely a way for us to become even more adapted consumers. And so that will be an important question for us. What does the appropriation of this moment, which stands out so strongly in Eastern thought, what does that mean in the West today? But I don't agree with Zizek's wholesale rejection of this insight. Yeah.
There's a German word, I think, which captures it quite well, which is Einsicht.
Yeah, exactly.
Insight.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the German word.
Einsicht.
Einsicht.
Yeah, Einsicht. So that you penetrate something. And Engels used it in Einsicht in die Notwendigkeit, a sort of recognition of necessity. So
Yeah, and this, see, that's right. And so it seems to me that with this notion of Einsicht or intuition, Anschauung, Ming, if that is the right word,
Yes.
that we have got something that is, you can't get behind it. You can't reduce it to something that is itself, that is conceptual. It's not an instance of, it's not a case of a concept and an instance. It's not a case of a definition. It's not a case of something, it's not rational. Yeah? That's that one.
I think you've got the exact right word pronounced as Ming. Because as you were talking, I'm thinking another Chinese word, just one more letter more than you said Ming. Actually, we say also Ming means Ming.
Well, that's what I was just saying, that, I mean, Ming also means understanding,
Yes.
but it's not intuition. It's not the same thing.
Well, what would you say intuition is?
直觉.
But what does it mean, intuition, as a notion?
It's direct grasping of something,
Yeah.
direct recognition of something.
No, Einsicht is not.
no, but intuition is not that either.
Yeah, I would say that intuition is not Einsicht either.
No, it's not.
It's not the same
necessarily,
thing.
but
I mean, it's just like me, it's not
We're-
the same thing as
we're
Einsicht.
circling around terms
Mhm.
because it's
It's
inconsiderable.
It's impossible, we don't have a word for it.
Yeah.
So we can put all the languages together, but we'll never.
So where did you borrow this Ming? Where did you read about it? Or where did it come from? From
Yeah,
your
so
perspective?
it comes from somebody whose work I've come to recently really admire. I'm going to pronounce it my way. So Chang Yuan, who was a professor of, he's dead now, but he was a professor of comparative philosophy at the University of Hawaii. And he wrote a wonderful commentary to the Tao Te Ching from the point of view of German philosophy, especially Hegel and Heidegger, because Heidegger, of course, refers to the Tao, notion of the Tao on the way to language, which we will read. And he makes a lot of this concept. But of course, I can't draw the character, otherwise you'll probably know what I'm talking
If I
about.
write it down there, can you recognize
No.
it?
And next time I will bring his commentary, and then we can look at it.
There are two parts in that word, Ming. One is the sun, the other part is the moon.
Yeah, that's right. That's it. That's the one. That's it. That's the one. Yeah, now that's right. That's why I thought it was so wonderful. It is a compound character.
Yes.
One side means the sun, the other side means the moon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I mean, the reason why that word comes to mean understanding and mean bright is precisely because that is the sun and the moon are both bright
Yeah.
and shining, so it means like something really clear, very clear to you.
Yeah.
So it's not the same thing as intuition. Not the same thing as intuition.
Yeah. But
No, I wouldn't say so.
What it
I mean,
shares.
because I specialize in conceptual history, so I very much insist on the differences between different concepts. They by no means can be conflated.
But
I think the word intuition is very unfortunate. So I use it to mean what you just said, a direct grasping of something. So that's the way it's used in I think, Latin philosophy. Intuere means to directly perceive.
Well, that is
something.
what 直觉 is. 直觉, which really means intuition. It means direct grasping.
And what is the difference between that and Ming?
Ming, as I said, I mean, etymologically speaking, it means something which is very clear to you.
Yeah.
That is why, I mean, because in classical Chinese, we don't differentiate between subject and object, so something clear to you means that you can understand it.
Exactly, yeah.
That is why it means understand also.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean,
Exactly. And that,
intuition.
and then that's where it approaches intuition, because intuition is also that which, for which subject-object distinction is not relevant.
No, but I mean, I'm sorry, but I think, okay, we cross understood, I'm sorry if I didn't make myself clear. What I meant is that in Chinese, because, in classical Chinese, because there's no subject-object distinction, so that is why the word, which means so clear to everybody, could also mean I can understand it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that the word itself, the mean itself, denotes the two-part process that I just described. I'm talking about in general, in classical Chinese.
Yeah. Okay, good. That's right. So, but this is precisely what I mean with world philosophy. We can take all these things and move on a little bit and have our own understanding.
But
So,
again, we are all different individuals. You have an understanding of the world and of that sensation. I have a different. And maybe people with different cultural, different background, world life experience and the intellectual level, they have also different understanding of.
Yes, I know, but I'm talking about, we're talking about a philosophical understanding of the different terms. And in that case, we have to maintain the philosophical rigor that different terms, are related to different things. It's like the word,
Sure.
明白, for example.
we're gonna move on.
明白 could be a lot more conceptual. That is precisely why I object to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Because, understood. I understand this concept. 我明白了. I understand this concept. So that is precisely why I think that it's not an appropriate translation.
Yeah, but so this important question, is it a concept or is it not?
Exactly. That is why I
So-
said it's not.
If I take the Kantian example, 2 + 3 = 5. Yeah? It's not conceptual, according to Kant. It's not a conceptual insight. Yeah? 2 + 3 = 5 is an intuitive insight.
Descartes said the same thing.
So it's intuitive in the sense that I have a direct perception of it. Numbers are not concepts. What are numbers are for Kant? It is all the intuition of space and time. Yeah? So for Kant, understanding that 2 + 3 = 5 is something more similar, like understanding the difference between left and right, than understanding that we are all human beings. And that's conceptual. This is a direct intuition into a number sequence. So it's not conceptual.
Well, the problem with intuition also, for an English speaker, is that it also means not a direct understanding, but an approximate understanding.
Yeah.
An understanding, a hunch,
Yeah.
Women's intuition, for
Yeah,
example.
exactly.
They just know
Yeah.
somehow.
Sixth sense.
So it also is a very
Sixth sense, exactly.
sixth sense. It's just something you know.
Yeah.
Which has to do with Einsicht as well.
Yeah.
That you have understood this,
Yeah.
but you've understood it without understanding it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And this is where it comes close then to Zen, I think.
Yeah.
This idea that it just is.
It just is. Yeah. Yeah. So, and what I'm trying to say is this. So what I'm trying to say is, if we want to understand process, we have to start there. And we already know now, see now, that this is a very complex thing and very difficult to understand. And that's so, okay, but I'm going to move on a little bit because I want to sort of go over these topics. We're talking about this in great detail. And starting with Bergson, so because this is also the question he asks in the Introduction to Metaphysics, where he develops his concept of what he calls intuition. And I've already said that it's essential also to understand Adorno. Yeah? So that's the first thing. The second thing is then this question, what is creativity? What is spontaneous creativity? What is spontaneous? The spontaneously you. What can we say about that? That's where David Bohm comes in. He's written a wonderful, he's not a philosopher, he was a physicist, but I think his short essay on creativity is wonderful and really shows how an understanding of creativity has to be part of process philosophy.
I'm sorry, who has written the essay on creativity?
Bohm.
Bohm.
Same one.
Oh,
Yeah, same one. The word creativity is of course a regular formation in English of an abstract noun, but it was introduced into English by Whitehead, which we find completely, this word is everywhere, and Whitehead's philosophy is certainly not everywhere. So there are 2 or 3 occurrences of the word creativity in the different contexts, so the different meanings before Whitehead uses it. And then it suddenly spread so widely that we don't even know where it comes from. But it was Whitehead who used it for the first time in the sense in which we know it today. So that is also an interesting thing for us to think about. What is that? How is that related? That will be the second topic. And we'll have 2 sessions in principle for each topic, but as this should be a spontaneous development, this might change. Yeah? Then I want to look at, in the context of this cultural history of Eastern thought in the West, I want to look at this period, 40s, 50s, and look at, on the European side, Adorno's critique of jazz, and especially the moment in jazz that has to do with improvisation, which is where his critique focuses on. Yeah? He says, "Oh, this is all rubbish, this improvisation." Yeah? And on the other hand, Jack Kerouac, his, if you know this text, The Sense of Spontaneous Prose, you may know it, a short text on how to write. And so there's like 10 rules of things that you should do when you want to write, and they are all about going into the moment of spontaneous improvisation and what it means for leaving behind inhibitions. He says, leave behind your syntactical inhibitions. And he talks about focusing on what he calls the dual center of interest, which is a Buddhist term, and he talks about. He says, you're a genius all the time. So there's the democratization of the notion of genius, which pervades his writing. And his writing, is, as you know, is directly copied from the practice of jazz improvisation. That's how he wrote. So I want to take this cultural moment of the emergence of improvised music and therefore also improvised spontaneous writing as a kind of key to understanding this spontaneous element in process in a better way. Yeah? I also think that this is still very, very useful for us today, also to ask ourselves in terms of the question of contemporary enslavement. If we talk about critical theory, talk about the idea that we are living under conditions of enslavement and formalization. Is there something in this notion of spontaneity that can help us there? Or is it from the start ideologically laden or too ideological to be anything to us? That would lead us to this formidable question of the logic and language of process. What does it mean to articulate process in language? What does that mean for the subject form of proposition? How does that relate to the grammatical structure of Chinese? So that's where we'll also look at the Tao Te Ching in some detail, and also other writings. And trying to understand how we can make sense of the relation between language and process. Now, yeah, don't want to say more about that. Then I want to go into. It is related to the question of the logic of process. I want to go into the question of, is process philosophy metaphysics, or is it not? Now we know the critique of metaphysics in contemporary Western philosophy. What is that aimed at? For Bloch it's very clear, for Engels it's the same point, Bloch takes that from Engels. Metaphysics is static thinking. when thought becomes dialectical, it's no longer metaphysics. That's a very particular notion of metaphysics that the Marxist tradition works with. Is there another sense of metaphysics, or how does process philosophy, which calls itself often metaphysics, how does it compare to the more radical critique of metaphysics that we find in contemporary German thought? And then there is this theme that actually runs through the whole thing, of course, of process east and west, and what we can learn from these original ways of articulating process that we find in the notion of the Tao, which I think is has a lot. There's a lot to be said about that, because there we also get the question of the inarticulability of process. So we all know it's the opening line of the Tao Te Ching, the Tao that can be said, the Tao that can be Tao is not the real or the constant Tao. Yeah? So what does that mean? And why is that a meaningful statement? And what does it say for our understanding of process, and for the attempt to philosophically articulate it? Because there might be a fundamental critique of the whole project of philosophy that comes with this understanding of process. Okay? That's the journey that I want to take, but as I said, it is open and we can shape it ourselves, because it should be like a group thing that we do. I've got some literature, and you have to all give me your email address, because I will send you the literature that you need to read.
The Adorno Unjust and Father Unjust, is that included in some book? I couldn't find that.
I don't know where it's included, but there's 2 essays that he wrote under the pseudonym Hector Rottweiler in the 30s, 40s. They're included in many, I'll look it up. And that totally interesting, in a way, this seminar also comes out of my encounter with the work of David Hall, whose student I could have been, but unfortunately I only found out about his work a year ago or so, and he too has passed away. And he didn't write much, which also makes him a philosopher to my heart. He wrote one short article, which we will start with next time, Process and Anarchy, the Taoist Vision of Creativity. Or no, the time after that, because first we'll do Bergson. Which I think is just, to my mind, is a brilliant way of comparing Taoist cosmology with process philosophy in the Whiteheadian version. It's a short article from 1978, published in Philosophy East and West, which was at the time a comparative journal, German comparative philosophy. And it strikes me as totally profound in the way he addresses what is at stake here. So I will send that article to you, and then we will discuss it in detail. And this David Hall, who passed away a few years ago, worked together with Roger Ames, who is a sinologist at the University of Hawaii, who studied here at SOAS, by the way. And together, shortly before Hall died, they made a translation of the Tao Te Ching, a new translation, based on the latest textual findings. There's all history, of course, the history of that text, in which he, in a way, completed what he started in 1978 with that article. He uses Whiteheadian process philosophy to write an interpretation of the Tao Te Ching that looks, as that text does, not just at metaphysical understanding, but also at ethics. And so the subtitle of that book is Making This Life Significant. That's the project that he says this text is about. But it is a remarkable example of, I think, of what I'm trying to talk about here, just world philosophy, how using, on the one hand, tradition of process philosophy, and on the other hand, tradition of Taoist philosophical thinking, something new emerges. So I want to pay special attention to that and see what we can learn from that. Yeah? So that's text number 2 there. Then I already talked about the introduction to metaphysics. We'll start with that. From Ernst Bloch, we will look at his text on the dialectical method from his book on Hegel, Subject-Object. There is translation. I say there are no translations available yet, but I found the dialectical method has been translated. That's chapter 9 from that book, and it's a wonderful chapter in which Bloch gives his perception, his interpretation of what dialectics is about. So we will read that text in order to draw the link, to make the link to the concept of the dialectic.
Who translated that?
I'll look it up in a minute. Yeah. I can actually look it up now.
Oh, it doesn't matter.
Because it's here. John Lamb. Have you heard of him? 1983.
No.
You see, you find new things all the time if you just look for that. And this is Hall. Process and anarchy. So I'll make that available to you. Yeah.
Excuse me, I'm so sorry, I don't have my glasses with me, so I can't see the screen. Could you tell me the website address where I can pull up the same thing that you are referring to right now? Can't read.
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's German philosophy, one word.
German philosophy, one word. Okay.
And then .wordpress.com. And then click seminar 2016-2017.
.word.com?
.wordpress.com. Yeah?
And 216, is that right?
Yeah, then when you get to that site, you can click on the seminar for this year and then
Okay, thank you.
So then we go to David Bohm's text on creativity, and also later on his text on the real mode, yeah? Experiment with language and thought. I said that already. This moment in the 40s, 50s, the early arrival of Buddhism in the West, also has a lot to do with John Cage and with his notion of silence. So with his composition 433, which you may know has 4 minutes 33 seconds of silence, as a way in which you can become aware of sound. Yeah, that was the idea. So you can become aware of all sounds by framing the moment. This is a composition with no music in it. Links fundamentally, I think, to the notion of process that we're trying to talk about.
So, I'm sorry, you said arrival of Buddhism in the West in what?
In the 40s, in the 40s, 50s. So this moment of Buddhism and the beat generation in American culture. So we'll talk about Heidegger when we discuss the metaphysics, the question of metaphysics. I already mentioned the essential spontaneous prose, Alan White's version of the real mode, and we'll refer to texts by Whitehead and Wittgenstein, Whitehead throughout, and Wittgenstein when it comes to this question of language as that which stands in the way of insight, rather than that which helps us. So for Wittgenstein it's a central idea. So philosophy is a bewitchment of the mind by the forms of language. We have to therapeutically remove ourselves from that in order to get to something that I think has a lot of parallels with this moment, this Zen moment that we talked about. That's what I want to do.
Sounds good.
Yeah, does it sound okay?
It sounds great.
So I noticed you published your PhD dissertation in 1998.
Yeah, that was my own decision.
So that's a process philosophy, right? And this is you can't make a comeback.
That's right.
Will you
Yeah.
revise your thesis and publish a new version?
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Please do.
That's right. For me to return to Whitehead after, or to process philosophy after many years in which I knew that, and also got confirmation from the son of Bloch, Jan Robert Bloch, that there is a link between process philosophy and Bloch's thinking, but it hasn't been articulated. The strange thing is that Bloch wrote the principle of hope in Harvard at the same place as where Whitehead was teaching, but they never met. And
It's like he was in Switzerland at the same time as Lenin, but never met.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. This is ships passing in the night. It's very strange. So in that sense, yeah. And so the question is, I think I've made that clear now. The point is to take this notion of process not as just another concept, but as making us think in a different way. Making us think in a fundamentally different way, in which we can start to begin to see how Western and Eastern traditions can come together and can maybe develop into something else. Yeah? That's what I wanted to do. So this very famous, all too famous Buddhist tale, I thought it would be nice to just give it to you. Maybe we would have seen it before. Is very much appropriate for this seminar. Yeah? A cup of tea. Non-in a Japanese master during the Meiji era received a university professor who came to inquire about Zen. Non-in served tea. He poured his visitor's cup full and then kept on pouring. The professor watched the overflow until he no longer could restrain himself. It is overfull, no more will go in. Like this cup, Nan-in said, you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup? Yeah. So, on the one hand, it means for us, I think, understanding the real contribution process thinking can make requires us to empty our cup of many presuppositions that we bring to philosophy. But it also says something about process itself, you say, because it is about flowing, and it is about overflowing. So it is about, well, this is an insight I think that will come later on. But I think that so there's something about process that has to do with overflowing, not just with flowing. It has to do with transgression, it has to do with communication by transgression. So, and that links it to the Hegelian dialectic, because Hegel says at the end of the phenomenological spirit of the introduction, he says the dialectical movement is a chain where is it? No, what was it not supposed to say? It's a chain where none of the members of the chain are not drunk. Ja, ein Kette ein Glied an dem eine Kette an dem kein Glied betrunken ist. And he speaks about the dialectic as an overflowing chalice. So I think this would be a very important theme to understand that there is that will mediate dialectics as interruption and continuous flow. We'll synthesize those two into a notion of overflowing. And spontaneity is, I think, in the end also closely connected to overflowing in sort of all sorts of spheres of existence. So that's the wise lesson at the beginning, before we go into that. Yeah. Sorry, Raheem.
Too late.
Just finished, that's a great time.
Come in. So that's what I want to do. I hope that you find it an exciting prospect and useful, but we can at all points make changes, because I would like, if you're interested, to really stick together for this year, and therefore we can build in explorations as we want to. That's not all, it doesn't have to be exactly the way I've outlined it before. But I hope that by doing this, we can make some real advances in how we think about what philosophy is and what the role of philosophy is in our lives, and maybe also in a slightly wider context. Yeah, welcome. I know that you came from.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. We just went through the whole thing, so. But I'm glad you're here, and I think you'll be able to come in future.
It'll be on YouTube.
It'll be on YouTube anyway. Yeah. So we in principle we meet every 2 weeks. Yeah, and then there will be holidays, etc. And we will have, I have 14 sessions planned, which will take us right until spring. But we can change that if we want to. So that's what I've got. The next session, after this is a final housekeeping remark I want to make. The next session is not going to be as it is announced in 2 weeks' time, because that is the midterm break. Yeah, already. So I want to move it to the 17th, which is next week. So I wonder if that would be possible for you. But then it would have to be from 12 to 2 instead of from 4 to 6.
That's excellent.
Yeah, is that good? So that would
Would
be,
that be permanently from 12?
but that will be just for this one, unless we want to.
And in the same room.
Probably yes, but I will confirm that. Yeah.
Well, probably I can't make it because in my diary I have a 1.5 day conference on arbitration of my own field.
Okay.
So that's the second day, lasts from 10 to 3 o'clock. Probably I'll miss the next
Yeah.
session.
Okay, but then you can watch it,
Yeah,
and then
sure.
you can come the next time, which is then normal.
Definitely. I may change my mind and come back to here.
Okay.
Keep me up there.
Yeah, good.
I haven't paid the
Okay.
yet.
Think about that.
Yeah, sure.
So, so that means that we don't have the session on the 24th, but that's now on the 7th from 12 to 2.
17.
17th. And I will confirm if it's this room or another room. But then other than that, it's normally as advertised. I don't know if you have all the dates. They are on the website of the Institute of Modern Language Research, but I can also email the whole list to you if that would be helpful. I just have to get all your email addresses.
Excuse me.
Okay.
So I read I don't know, maybe just I was reading the newspapers and then YouTube led me to this little story. It says a Buddhist monk set up a store to sell some bakery, and a rich man came, handed over a £20 or dollars, and then the monk handed this bakery to him, and this gentleman was waiting for change, and then the Buddhist monk replied, "Change come." They put the money under the safe. The Buddhist monk said, "The change come from within." It's just a resonance with your story of the tea pouring. Yes. We feel they give the change.
Yeah. Exactly. This is an interesting point. So, okay. Well, any comments or questions about the setup of the thing?
I'm just wondering, this is very good, and I'm just wondering whether we can have more sessions, have more meetings,
Yeah, instead of
rather than just bi-weekly, because bi-weekly there aren't that many sessions.
No, there will be only 12, 14 in a year.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let's see how it goes. We have next week already. And then we can see if we want to adapt the schedule
Yeah.
after next time.
You mentioned that in the past you met every week, it wasn't it right? Like, so-
Last year we met every week,
So
but
why
before
change?
that we did every 2 weeks.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a little bit, last year was good because it was quite intense, but there were very few people who attended, Rahim was one of them. That was an intense seminar. And so we thought maybe this year a little bit more relaxed, but yeah, we can talk about that. We can see how it goes, and we can also change it later in the year. We don't have to stick to the same
But
pattern.
again, you also have to go to University Central Lancaster and
Oh no, I'm not there anymore.
uh,
No, I'm here and at Middlesex.
Middlesex.
Yeah. Do I have all your, can I read this?
I don't think that's
You haven't sent me. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's what we will do. Now, for next time, I want to start with this Bergsonian notion of intuition. And as we do in this seminar, we tend to read, just the original texts without too much fussing about scholarly literature. So,
That's English? Is that English?
because it's a German philosophy seminar, when it's German text, we tend to have the German and the English. But this year, I think we'll just do everything in English. Thanks. So I would like to start with this introduction to metaphysics, so that's like the pre-reading. It doesn't mean we're going to talk only about that text, but try to read. It's not long. It's more like an article than a book.
Is it something you send us or?
I will send you a link because it's available online. So we'll start with that, and then in that context, but that's probably not going to be next week, we'll also read David Hall's article, which I will email to all of you. Yeah? And then we take it from there. Okay? So it's a little bit, we have 2 hours, and we use 2 hours every time, but now we're just going to stop now, because I think it was a lot of information for everyone to take in. So yeah, I'm sorry, we're glad you came anyway, but we'll have to talk about what we can do.
Is this on
The blog. Do you remember? There's a blog. Yeah. I used to also put all the reading on the blog, but of course that is violation of copyright, so you can't do that. So we'll have to make sure that we stay within the law as far as the distribution of text is concerned, which we will do. Okay, so thanks all for coming. We always have the habit of going for a drink, those who are interested afterwards. And it's quite, I think, quite fitting for the theme, but we always go to the rising sun, which is at the end of Store Street, Tottenham Court Road. So if you want to join us for a drink there, very welcome to come now, and otherwise you don't have to. And then we'll see each other next week. Confirm the room. Okay?
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.